Hey everyone, today we are talking about an all-time classic movie, a real banger, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. That's right, 1989, Rick Moranis. I can't believe it. I'm joined by radio announcer and content creator Zach Mander. We had a blast talking about this movie. There's definitely a lot of questionable parenting decisions being made, and also some really interesting family dynamics to discuss. If you've ever seen this movie, you're going to love this conversation. My name is Anthony Francis. You are listening to the Successful Working Parents podcast, where normally we talk to working parents, but we've been having some fun switching it up, talking about parenting dynamics in movies instead. I appreciate you listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and share with a friend. Anyway, on to the show. Welcome back to the Successful Working Parents podcast, the podcast where we talk to successful working parents. Still working on the title. My guest today is Zach Mander, and we were talking about the 1989 smash hit, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Zach, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, happy to have you. So, why don't you do a quick introduction for the audience?
I'm a radio announcer and content creator from Brisbane, Australia. So we're speaking from the opposite side of the world at the moment.
Yeah, and you got the radio voice to back up the credentials, so I'm excited. I'm excited for this one.
Yeah, a little bit.
So, what is your relationship? What is your relationship with this movie?
I think I watched it as a kid. I don't really remember. I mean, I've got some type of memory of it. I think I might be more familiar with the sequel, Honey, I Blew Up the Kids, which was maybe a few years later. I was born in 1989. So, yeah, I don't think I would have seen this one in the cinema, but I maybe watched the VHS a few years later.
Yeah, I feel similarly. I feel like some of those older movies, because I was born in '87, so because I was a little bit younger, like the newer one I liked more. Like the sequel, I like, even though it's
Yes.
probably significantly worse. I don't plan on rewatching that one. But Rick Moranis as well, like a real icon. And I was reading up on him. He kind of like retired from acting for a while and stepped away from it, but he was really, uh, you know, an icon in the early '90s and late '80s.
Well, I was talking to my wife about this actually after watching it because I thought he's so good in this film. He's got such a he's got a thing, He's kind of got
Yeah,
a very unique voice,
yeah,
and I was like, oh, like he could have done so much more. And then I thought about it, and I was like, well, he did do quite a lot of iconic movies. He's got the Honey I Shrunk the Kids franchise. He was in Ghostbusters. He was in Spaceballs. I think he was on Saturday Night Live, wasn't he? Wasn't that where he was from? So, I mean, he did have an iconic career.
yeah. He was in Little Giants, if you recall. He was in a bunch of stuff.
So he did make the most of it. At first, my initial thought was kind of like, oh, we didn't get the most we could have out of him, but I think he did have a great career.
Yeah. Well, Rick Moranis, if you're listening, we appreciate all the work you've done. But yeah, so okay, so we're 1989, Honey I Shrunk the Kids. So this movie kicks off. We set things up pretty quickly. We got the dad's the inventor. I don't know if you caught this in the very beginning. He kind of sends his daughter a message from his room. It was almost like early text messaging.
Yeah, it was
Did you
hilarious.
see that? I was like, wow, this is really cutting edge stuff. It was a huge machine, but it was exactly what we would do now, is just text each other.
Well, I remember seeing that as a kid and just being like, what a time to be alive. Can you
Yeah,
imagine having this type of contraption in your house? And now that's what we do. Often my wife and I are texting, from inside the house.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I remember when I saw this as a kid, the idea of an inventor. I thought I'd come across more of them in my life. I don't know if I've ever really. I don't know if I've ever met an inventor since, but it seemed like such an interesting job to have.
Yeah, it's one of those ones as a kid that you think is a possibility, don't you? It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm going to be an inventor. But, how he's struggling, and we're probably going to get to this in his career. But what do we think his actual job is? Like, where's he making? Is he just a freelance inventor? He's going to come up with this shrinking ray and then sell it, or is he working for a university? It's never really clear, is it?
No, that was one of my questions. I think he is a freelance inventor, and I think he's just trying to get one of his things off the ground. And he referenced at one point, like, I have to go back to work somewhere else. So
Oh,
I
yeah,
think
it does.
I think, and it's obviously putting a stress on the marriage, understandably. So I think he's trying to figure it out. Um, but yeah, so we set the whole context up. We have the nerdy son, we have the typical teenage daughter, the mom's at grandma's house because they had to fight because of the aforementioned too much inventing and not enough income, I guess. And then they also have the neighbors who are like a little bit on the white trash side, I guess, for lack of a better term. But yeah, so he's making a shrinking ray, and I was also trying to understand what the value. Like he seems to think this is the best invention possible, like comparing it to electricity. But I wasn't really sure what the value to society would be of a shrinking ray.
Well, he mentions that in his pitch that he has to, I don't know, it's like a science convention later on. He is pitching it as reducing payloads to space. So the biggest cost to space is how much things weigh. And he's like, we can shrink everything down and launch it into space. I mean, then what would you do in space? Would you have to expand it again? I guess you would.
Yeah,
Um,
you got to get that. You got to get that ray up there, I guess.
yeah, so, I mean, it's not without problems. It kind of makes enough sense, don't you think? It reminds me of like Jurassic Park, where it's like, where they get the DNA from the mosquito in the ember. And I'm like, it makes enough sense that you can kind of go with it. I think his logic is most of uh, an atom is free space.
Yeah, that's
Like
right. That's
if we
right. Yeah.
kind of move everything closer, and it's like, I mean, it doesn't make sense, but it makes enough sense for the kids' movie to be hung on it.
Yeah, like we're in. We we
Yeah.
we're bought into it. We're accepting the situation. And then I thought it was interesting when he left the house. This is like that era where you and I probably grew up in this, where it was like you could just leave the kids alone at the house and just like let them run the house. Like I just feel like you don't see that anymore.
Well, I'm wondering that. I did think about that. I'm trying to correlate my feelings versus reality because I think about my kids now. I've got a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I'm like, oh, I wouldn't be confident leaving them in the house. But I'm like, what's the girl? Like maybe she's about 16. The little kid's maybe 10. I'm like,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. I remember being left alone at those ages.
yeah, for sure. And I think it's like, hey, you clean up, you mow the lawn. Like I'll be back later. Good
Yeah.
luck. So I thought that was funny. And then yeah, the next door neighbor, they're kind of setting him up as like the bad dad, I guess. He's pushing sports and fishing on his son. His son's not interested. I thought it was nice when his son was like, these aren't my things. And he's like, what is your thing? He's like, oh, well, I'll let you know when I find out what it is. Like at least
Mm.
he has that self awareness that he's like trying to figure it all out.
Yeah, and he's kind of there's some things that are strangely uh, feel very current, and then there's other things that seem really dated, and that I guess that is a thing true of teenagers over a long period of time. But like he didn't follow stereotypes of like the teenage boy, which was kind of surprising for 1989.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess we're supposed to think like the dad is like a typical dude, and then the son's like doesn't want to be a typical dude. I guess is the idea. Well, we'll get more into the dad in,
Well,
in
I
a minute.
found interesting with the dad as well. Did he strike you as quite young?
Yeah, I guess now that you mentioned it, I wasn't thinking that at the time, but I definitely see that now.
Well, I looked up the actor's age, and he was 31 when he's playing that role. And I think he's meant to have a 16-year-old son. And they put him in kind of like these. He's wearing his kind of hunting hat and a typical kind of dad jacket and flannel, but still, once he kind of takes it off and you kind of stare at him a little bit, I'm like, you're way too young to be playing this kind of old middle-aged dad role.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Okay, so we get the shrinking. The baseball, I guess, fixes the machine somehow. Now, what are your thoughts on the special effects? Like, did they hold up the whole sweeping scene, and then we just they're setting up the whole idea of like everything's gonna be like really tiny, and you're gonna see
Mm.
like the macro micro world. I think it's early precursor to Ant-Man
Yes, well,
scenes
the
later on.
worst. It gets worse when they're in the backyard. The worst part of it is when they start handling the animals, the insects in the backyard. But I think at that point, the sweeping I thought was pretty good, really.
Yeah, I thought it was good. I remember thinking like this must have looked really cool in '89. That was really my thought. I was obviously I today you probably would have done a better job, but I remember thinking like this must have been really impressive for the time.
Oh yeah, I
Um,
think so. And also, it I do remember the feeling of when you watch it as a kid, that fear, like it captured that really well. Like as a kid, you kind of imagine it's one of the things you imagine the most, being really small and being able to climb on things and whatever. And that fear of like now the world is enormous. I
yeah,
think they've captured that well.
yeah, I agree. But I to your point, I wrote down like I felt like the grass when they got outside the grass. I was like, what kind of grass is this? This isn't really.
It was very deep, wasn't
It was deep grass. It had like little like handheld climbers on it. There was some were like curled down like a slide. It's just not the way grass is really set up. I don't think.
Yeah, do you think that was a big? It must have been. They must have made kind of like some sets, some big grass sets.
Yeah, they must have had like a whole area of like the giant version of the thing. I think it was I thought that was it was a cool idea and it was cool to see that how they applied everything. But yeah, I think in 2024 we would have had a better setup. I think.
Definitely.
It, in general, in your perspective as an Australian, like, do you when you watch a movie based in America, like, do you feel like the people are different, like the family is different, or does it feel like kind of like pretty similar, just different voice, different accent?
Well, we grew up on this type of thing, so nothing stands out at me as strange, but it's definitely very American. So fishing with you. Well, I mean, we fish, but just the fishing, the baseball, that feels very American. The houses, I was going to ask you that. Do those houses exist where you kind of have the backyards touching each other? So, you're both on your back porch and you can see into each other's backyards. That feels like very American. I feel like that we would have a fence or a tree or or our houses wouldn't be set up in those rows typically where they're all
Hmm.
kind of the same. Um, so that feels really American. And I wondered when, it opens with this wide scene of the postman putting the letter in the mailbox is very typical of that era.
Yeah,
Um, and I was like, oh, it fills me with nostalgia, actually, even though I've never been around anything like that, because it
yeah,
reminds me of childhood movies. But does that actually exist?
yeah. No, totally. That's how the suburbs look in the
Okay.
around here. Like very normal to have your yards touching, or sometimes not even fences. Where I grew up, we just there was like the yards just like blended into each other, and you just kind of respected each didn't go on each other's property unless you were friends.
Yeah, right. It's very close knit.
Yeah, very close. I mean, it depends on the area, right? There's certainly more rural parts of it's big. It's a big country, but anything that's like in like the metro area, like suburbs outside the city, are pretty close together like that. And I believe
Yeah.
this is taking place in Fresno, California.
Ah, okay. I didn't know where it was. Yeah, I mean, so that sticks out. The house sticks out. Um, Besides that, pretty similar themes. Um, yeah.
What were your thoughts on little Ron? I thought he was like, first of all, that hat he had. I don't know where you get a hat like that, but I thought that was cool. But he was like a Bart Simpson. Like he had like he literally said at one point like blow it out your shorts to somebody. like
Well,
like
this
I
is
just
Bart Simpson before Bart Simpson.
that's what I looked up as well. Yeah, so Simpsons came out, believe it or not, the end of '89, which is crazy. But yeah, he was like almost like a prototype for Bart Simpson.
As a character, well, firstly, I thoroughly enjoyed the fashion,
Hmm.
just generally.
Yeah.
It was a real kind of throwback, and all that type of stuff is back in vogue now. So it
Oh
was
yeah.
really cool to see a lot of those kind of the denim jacket without the sleeves with a big patch on the back, and they all had kind of cool hats. As a character, he really annoyed me. I was like, once they shrunk and stuff, he was like, he still wanted to go fishing. And maybe you could say, like, oh, well, he's a kid. He doesn't understand what's at stake here. But I'm like, dude, you've been shrunk to a tiny human and you're still worried about going fishing.
Yeah. Oh no. It was he. It's all he cared about was fishing.
And I guess they could say that I think from a story point of view, they needed someone to push back. Like, it wouldn't have been particularly interesting if the group who got shrunk into the backyard all got along immediately, because you needed someone to add some kind of conflict there. But just logically, it really annoyed me. I'm like, man, can you just chill out? Just at every turn, he was wanting to do something completely ridiculous.
Yeah, yeah, he was a lot. Again, he I'd say he crawled so Bart Simpson could fly. You know what I mean? Um, but yeah, so okay, so this is also interesting because so you said your kids are one and three, right? My daughter is like 14 months old, so a little bit early for us. But the idea also of like you come home and you're not sure where your kids are, and you're not immediately worried, right? They're both him and the wife are just like I'm sure they're at the mall or something. There's no
Mm.
phones. There's no note. Like that's just definitely not how it's going down in 2024. I think in '89 it makes sense, but I don't know. This is a little. I haven't had the experience yet, obviously, but I feel like I would be like, okay, well, I have to immediately locate her before I can go about my day.
100%. I think that's a thing from a bygone era. I think, from what I kind of understand, mainly people are basically your family's trackable all day now through Find My Phone and whatever. I don't know if kids have phones, but I don't imagine you're sending them off into the world with no way of contacting them. It seems completely wild now, but I do remember the same thing. Like, I remember in my teenage years, my parents, you'd leave in the morning, and my parents, as long as I was back at a certain time,
Yeah,
but I think about now, if what happens if I didn't come back, what were they going to do? I think often they wouldn't really know where I was, which would be terrifying. I would be absolutely terrified to think of my kids now not knowing where they were, but I don't know.
yeah. I mean, I used to. I mean, I would tell my parents where I was going, but then I would just be gone for the day, and I would just come back. I think. I think they show you actually what you probably do eventually is you just call every friend's house that you know of, and then eventually you call the cops. It just took them a few hours to get there. I'm sure I would have been much more worried about it than they seem to be.
And I think the reason that I have anxiety about it now is because I know of a different way, because we know that you can have mobile phones and stuff. But when that was never an option,
Yeah.
you can't really be anxious about it because that's just the way it always was. So now not being able to contact someone feels, or if I didn't even know where my wife was, for example, or if I wasn't able to contact her, even for a day, that would seem like a really long time that we weren't in contact. But, I remember even when we were dating 15 years ago, um, she went to America for a month, and like it was like we were emailing like once every couple of days or something. But that seemed
Yeah.
wild now because you'd be
Yeah.
video calling every day.
Yeah. No, it's so true. Like I don't know how people you'd make a plan with somebody and you just would show up and hope that they were there too, right? Like that's
And
that's
then if they
crazy.
weren't, what did you do? You just had to
Yeah.
leave and just say, "Oh
Yeah.
well, catch them next time."
I guess you just had to show up, right? You couldn't. I think cell phones really enabled a lot of flaking, a lot of last minute bailing on plans.
Yes.
You know what I mean? But running late not being an issue. So I feel like added to the list of things, it's hurt society for.
Yeah, it is
Um,
interesting. I wonder, it's only been 15 years ish, but 20 years maybe. I wonder, it'd be interesting to see the younger kids. Well, already you're seeing the kids, they don't like talking on the phone. It's like, it seems confrontational. Um, and yeah, but when we were younger, and I mean, I was really on the tail end of this, but like, you had to call your friends and you had to talk to their parents like on the
yeah,
phone. They'd pick up
yeah,
and be like, "Hey, can I talk to Timmy or whatever?" That seems like I don't think that younger generations would be comfortable doing that today.
yeah. No, I think even people. I know people my age that are like, "Why are you calling me? Just text me now." So definitely, it's not. It's definitely not as in vogue as it used to be. Okay, so the dad eventually goes upstairs. Goes upstairs. He realizes, well, the chair and couch for somehow didn't get swept up. I found that a little bit strange, but I guess maybe they're a different area, and that's how he realizes we need that. So he realizes, oh, I shrunk stuff in this room, but he just didn't scoop those up when he put everything in the garbage can. And
Yeah,
then
that
he's
was a bit
like,
of a plot hole, I think.
yeah, and then he was like, oh crap, I guess. So then he automatically assumes, well, I must have then shrunk the kids. Like there's no other options, right? They're definitely shrunk. But then I guess he goes to the garbage can and he sees the little tear. So he's just assuming his kids are shrunk in the grass, right? So we just talked about how we'd feel if we didn't know where our kids were, but like, how do you feel if you know you shrunk your kid in there in your lawn? Again, I felt like he wasn't really like acting appropriately.
No, well, it's funny because he tries to stay off the lawn, and they kind of do a bit of a comedic piece where he has to try to get back to the house without standing on the lawn because he's terrified of squishing them. But I'm thinking the whole time, like, how they're kind of like so small that he almost needs a magnifying glass to see them. And so he's climbing along the fence, and I'm like, but why couldn't they be on the fence? It
Right.
doesn't.
Right.
It doesn't. They don't have to be in the grass. They could be anywhere where you're walking. So, yeah, the urgency and the terror probably was played off for more comedy than reality.
Yeah, he's sort of like they'll be fine in the grass, and then he rigs up the machine, and he at one point he has the crutches. So I'm like, you're still stomping with crutches
Yes,
in the lawn.
it's almost
Uh,
worse in a way. You're concentrating all that force to a very small area.
that's a good point. I hadn't considered that. That's true. But yeah, then we get to see like all these. This is where like the fun of like the camera stuff is because all these harrowing things happen. You get the bee, the sprinkler, the ant, the fire, like all these things that are so minor and obviously in real life are huge monsters and catastrophes for tiny little shrunk people.
Yeah, it's really again. It kind of captures the imagination, doesn't it, of being a little kid, and you do think of those things like fighting off an ant, and they are terrifying. The only thing that stops them from being terrifying is scale. An ant at its size obviously is no threat to a human, but yeah, you think about it. If it was human size, that is a terrifying creature.
Yeah, and also they just were like, let's fight it. Like they just they just all went for it. I thought that was funny too. Wait, but I forgot to mention the cookie that attracts the ant. Like, how good did that cook? I remember this from when I was a kid. I remember thinking, like, man, I'd love to just have a giant cookie like that.
Yeah, I do remember those types of thoughts as a kid, but as an adult, he's like, there's a giant cookie or a relative to them that's giant, and they're like one of them, the little boy is he's like taking scoops of the cream in the middle, and it literally made me feel sick as an adult watching it. I was like, imagine like sticking your head in that and eating that much sugar. That's how your brain kind of changes
Yeah, that's
since
a sign.
childhood.
That's a
Yeah.
sign that you're getting older, man. Okay, but also I want to ask you about the scorpion. You're from Australia. I imagine I've never seen this really like a scorpion like out in the wild, but they're also much bigger than ants, right?
Much bigger, and I think they're quite similar sized here. Although, yeah, I'm not really sure. I've never. We do have scorpions. I've never seen a scorpion, or maybe one, maybe once. That scorpions aren't something super common to Australian households. We have a lot of spiders. So if we were to be shrunk in the backyard now, what would I be scared of? I'd certainly be scared of spiders and snakes. Those would be the
Hmm.
two big things. Maybe bees as well, which they have here. But scorpions, I don't know if I've ever come across one. Maybe once, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't. I don't think they really are in the Northeast, but I did look into this because I was so confused. But they do exist in the Fresno, California region, so it is technically accurate that there's a scorpion there. But I just thought it shouldn't be similar size to an ant. It should be like above the blades of grass almost, right? Or like it should be much bigger than it looks.
Yeah, well, you think about an ant. I mean, it's like you put an ant on your fingernail, and it still doesn't even take up the whole fingernail. And you think about a scorpion, I think it's going to be bigger than that. I think there's probably an array of scorpions, but I wonder if a scorpion, similar to how you talk about the oddball inventor, or some people say that they think that quicksand was going to be more of a problem in life based on 90s kids TV shows. Similarly, I think Scorpion was one of those just textbook scary creatures. Don't you think? It's like because they got the big tail with whipping, and I
Oh,
feel like that is in there because it's like, yeah, that's the scariest thing we can think of them coming
oh,
across.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, especially again, like where I grew up, or where I live, like there's no such thing as scorpions around here, right? So, or as far as I know, so I would be like freaked out if I saw a scorpion, and I think that they're definitely playing up on that like monster vibe. So yeah, it should have been bigger. Would have been even scarier, I think. Okay, so we talked about the dad's reaction to when he realized he shrunk them, and he does eventually say like, okay, like I think they'll be okay out there in the yard. They tell the neighbors like initially just like pissed that he lost his like deposit. He can't go fishing. They're
It's
they're
eighty
really they're
dollars. Yeah.
yeah, $80 deposit. That's right. Yeah, but like, what are you gonna do when you? It's one thing if you shrunk your kids and you know they're in your yard, but if your neighbor tells you you shrunk their kids, I feel like you'd have no options, right? You probably feel really defeated because you like what do you? You're pretty powerless.
That's the wild thing. Yeah, well, maybe we'll get to this a little bit later, but their reactions, especially as this like he's meant to be this scary, unreasonable dad, the neighbor, and yet his reaction seems pretty mild that his kids are shrunk. Well, at first they don't believe him, and then they are convinced. Um, yeah, you'd be enraged. Like your neighbor has an experimental shrinking ray, and your children have been shrunk. Like,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah. I don't
a
think I'd
lot to
just be
take
like
in.
going home. I'd be like, I don't know what I would do, but it'd be tough pill to swallow.
Yeah. Well, I think I'd get the authorities in immediately. I don't know. I was going to say maybe you'd want the guy, the police to come in intervene, but I'm like, maybe you don't want the authorities to be involved because this guy, this experiment, this inventor, he holds the key. The only hope you really have of getting the kids back is if he can reverse the shrinking ray. So, yeah,
That's
maybe
true.
you do kind of just want to keep him on side long enough to try to get the kids back before you can seek some legal justice. I'm not sure if there is any precedent in the law books for shrinking someone against their will. Um,
I can't imagine there is.
I don't know how they would process that in the courts. There's not really crossed in the story. They seem to at the end just gloss over what happens next. It seems that they all just get along.
Yeah, you're right. They're just friends after that. They don't even really care. Like I would not trust my kids around that in that house anymore. That's for sure.
No, no, you'd think, hey, can you put a lock on the door to the experimental shrinking ray? I think that's the big lesson I learned from this. It's like, hey, if you're going to have an experimental shrinking ray, don't leave the 10-year-olds unsupervised around it. That's just
Right.
101 with experimental rays.
Especially when the ray is currently exploding things instead of shrinking them.
That's right. That's where he left it, didn't he? Just before he ran out the door, it had just exploded an apple. And he's like,
Yeah.
yeah, cool, kids, just don't
Yeah.
touch it.
Yeah. Right. But I did actually feel like Russell is the only character that really has an arc because he starts off like total asshole, like just disappointed that his son doesn't want to play football, pissed that he can't find them, and then they start to show like a glimmer of him like caring because he puts the light on at night
Yeah.
when he finds out that they're shrunk. So it's like suddenly he does care because at first he's talking to the cops. He's like, "These kids are so happy. Like, why would they ever run away?" Like he's just like delusional, thinks he's crushing it, and then yeah, they show him actually showing a little care at the end.
Yeah, the light on was a nice moment. I read that as like, because he didn't believe that they had been shrunk.
Yeah,
And I felt the light on was, him starting to chip away that maybe he was believing it and
yeah,
that there was some care there for the kids. And another moment was, which also feels a little dated now, is that he throws the cigarette onto the lawn and the kids say, they're like, "Where's this cigarette from?" And his two sons go, "Oh, that's Dad. He's been smoking. He only smokes when he's worried." And the two boys look at each other knowingly, like, you know, our parents are worried about us. Um, so there's a bit of a human touch there as well.
yeah. Flicking your cigarette onto your neighbor's lawn, like, so messed up. Also, that's a good point. Was it already after?
No,
It might
that
have
must
been
have been before he knew.
before he knew, right? Okay, but he's still flicking on his neighbor's lawn. Like it's still not cool, but he doesn't know his
No,
kids.
that's pretty.
He doesn't know his kids are there though.
Yeah, I mean, we would say in Australia that would be a significant fire risk. Is that something that people would be concerned about in America? The flicking
Yeah,
of cigarettes is like the main way wildfires are started.
yeah, that's a big deal here. I mean, cigarette smoking has really been like cracked down on over here. You can't really smoke anywhere anymore. Like obviously in your own yard you can, but in the city, like they just you can't smoke in parks. You can't smoke outside of certain buildings. Like they really crack down on it.
Yeah, I saw someone smoking over the weekend at a bus stop, and I was saying to my wife, "That's a bit of a throwback. You don't see people smoking cigarettes anymore. Like a lot of vaping." But I'm like,
Yeah.
wow, old school cigarettes, they're still around.
Yeah, well, that would have been funny if there was like a vaping moment in this movie where like the vape got shrunk, and like the teenagers like just wants to smoke his vape the whole time.
Well, that's yeah. Maybe they've remade so many films, haven't they? This one seems prime. Shrinking films were kind of a genre for a while. I'm thinking of The Borrowers in the mid '90s. I'm thinking of like Fern Gully, which was an
Fern
animated film
Gully, oh,
in
what a
the
great
early
movie!
2000s.
Yeah, I love that
Oh,
movie.
sorry, early '90s. So yeah, there were quite a few. Yeah, maybe they're primed for a comeback. You could have a Honey I Shrunk the Kids remake in 2024.
You know, I read that Rick Moranis was signed on to do a sequel, like another sequel, and it never came to fruition. So,
As in
like
recently?
recently, yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
wow. Where he maybe is a grandparent or something.
yeah, maybe like a legacy sequel, and we just catch up. You know, he's got some new Ray,
Yeah, that'd
but
be cool.
I agree with you. I'd love to see some more shrinking movies, though I did feel like a lot of this is solved if you have a cell phone in your pocket. Right?
Yes,
Like the
true.
whole issue is they can't communicate. So I feel like if they, I guess they can still be shrunk, and there's maybe like they don't know how to reverse it. But as far as like they're shrunk, not only are they shrunk in this movie, they can't find them. Right? That's really the bigger issue is this they're just
Yes.
lost. So a cell phone would have solved it. One of many things that just is a little bit different about 2024.
Well, you know what I thought of too when they were, and this is something a legitimate thing you're taught as a if you go missing as a child, or what I think we're told to tell our kids is like stay put. Um, and that's what I thought would also solve it. I know they were kind of brushed away quite literally by the brush, but I thought if you guys had just got to a point that you knew that was going to be safe in the room, you knew that
Yeah,
the dad was going to come back into the room, you knew contextually if he was next to the ray, he might be able to figure out that you've been shrunk. Um, yeah, actually, I guess they didn't choose to go to the backyard. So, and they were trying to get back to the house. So they were trying to do that. But yeah, my immediate thought was like, don't leave the room, find a safe spot, and wait for him to come back.
yeah. Well, that kind of brings us to like the final act is they survive the lawnmower, and then the dog shows up and saves them and drops the son off in the bowl of cereal.
That was a terrifying scene, wasn't it?
That was terrifying because he really almost ate his kid. And then imagine, the other kids were fine. So imagine you eat one, and then the other ones are survive. Like it's a tough thing to live with.
It was also gives context to how big they were. Because what is that? Like little Cheerios, the cereal. And he's kind of swimming in the middle of it. He's not even holding onto it like a floaty.
Yeah,
But that's
yeah.
how
No,
tiny
it's
they were. Yeah.
yeah, no, yeah. It's like bigger than like an inner tube to him. Like so.
And you could see
Uh,
the. I liked watching the. I liked trying to figure out how they were doing the special effects, and you could see it was quite convenient for them because they had that clear kind of masking line where they could just cut out the circle around um, the Cheerio and then insert it into like a bowl. Although I think sometimes too they would just sort of used prop Cheerios that were huge. But there was a moment where it scooped up where you can kind of see the mask lines, and I was like, oh, it's so interesting in that era of movies how you can see it, like the separation, whereas you never see that now. Like they're so good at hiding
yeah.
kind of those mask lines and stuff like that. Well, it's all digital also, but yeah, I really enjoyed seeing that.
No, it's funny you say that. I actually didn't catch that, but I was doing like a little bit of googling about the movie, and apparently there's a point when you can see the set wall in the back. Like it's like
Ah,
like the right like the lot that it was filmed on. There's like a blue wall that I guess they didn't remove or paint over or whatever. So yeah, this is the era where you catch stuff like that sometimes.
yeah, I love it.
Yeah. But yeah, so then as we said before, they get saved, and then they're all just hunky dory. No one's mad at each other. Russell's not pissed. And again, Russell, I feel like, is the only one that like has a real arc here, where he tells his son he's proud of him. He doesn't care if he doesn't want to play football anymore, and they have this really nice moment. I'd like to think that after that they kind of move forward. They show him without his hat in the final scene. I guess is that to like indicate that he is like a different kind of guy now.
Yeah, was the hat the issue? Was it? Was that a signal of a toxic parenting trait? I think they tried to do an arc with the mum as well, but it just didn't work as well. Those two things are my two biggest plot points: is the fact that somehow your neighbors shrunk your kids, and yes, it's worked out okay, but you think you would have some type of residual instead of being they're actually in a better relationship than what they were at the start. He now likes him for what reason?
Right.
That he shrunk him and then was able to reverse what he had done. I guess they might say that the technically the neighbor's kid shrunk him because he hit a baseball through the window. But probably even what makes even less sense to me is that the mum, so apparently they are on such poor terms that she has to spend a night away from the family.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no real reason why she's come around. She comes around to him uh, immediately upon knowing that he's shrunk the kids, and then she's on board and she's helping him out, and then the marriage seems to be saved. Is it because the shrinking ray, despite the fact that it shrunk the kids, has worked, and that's what they've been working towards for all these years, and that's the point that was causing friction in the marriage? I couldn't really understand what was the point that she went from just 24 hours earlier having to be at her mum's house, not being able to stay in the same house, that now she was like the relationship and the marriage was on again.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when it first started thinking like, oh, this is weird. I don't remember like this part of the movie where the mom's like staying at the grandma's, and it becomes very forgettable. Like I guess that's
Yes.
probably why, because they don't really, it doesn't really follow through properly. I think you're right though. I think it was he was just dedicated to the job too much or to the inventing too much, and it was putting a strain on things. I imagine he's not bringing in much income. She seems to be like trying to sell some houses to support the family. So it would have been interesting to see that, right? Like the prequel where it's just him like failed invention after failed invention, and their marriage is slowly just deteriorating. I think that'd be an interesting movie too.
Well, I did think that was interesting. uh, there were some things like the house fell apart without her, so there was some gender role stuff there where obviously she was the only one doing anything. But
True.
the fact that she was working um, as a sole breadwinner, I think it seems. I thought like, oh, you got dual working parents. Um, yeah, I thought that was interesting in 1989. I guess 1989 is not as old as what I might be thinking, but yeah, there were some things that I was like, oh, this movie is more recent in some ways than I remember, and in other ways that it's not.
Well, I think similarly, like Rick Moranis is just not your typical dude, right? So I feel like they have this like almost like more progressive kind of a setup, and he really represents more of like the average like man in 2024
Yeah,
than a man from the 80s, you know?
yeah. I guess you got that conflict with the neighbor, and that's why they don't really get along because he's a weirdo. Rick
Yeah.
Moranis' character. It's like, what is he doing? They're looking over the back fence, and he's being a kind of an oddball again. Yeah, and then the dad represents the more traditionally masculine, the fishing, the football, and wanting his kids to do the same thing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's Russell's like the more like typical like dad of the 80s. All right. A few questions to discuss. So, what do you think has aged poorly since 1989?
Well, the special effects,
Yeah.
like just on a practical point of view, it's like some of the where they've. I think when they're flying on the bee, and understandably it'd be difficult to do, but where they've cut out their hair, it's just like this really big matte line. Um, yeah, I know you mentioned that it was probably mind blowing at the time, which obviously you have to take in the context. But yeah, the special effects are pretty bad. Uh, but besides that, there was nothing. What did anything jump out at you?
Just like the some of the parenting stuff about like not knowing where your kids are and kind
Yeah.
of being okay with that, and not contacting them. Like I thought that was a little bit more like just you just wouldn't see that anymore.
Yeah.
Although some
Also,
you could maybe argue that that's like better. Like there's no helicopter parenting back then, you know.
yeah, and I guess as we mentioned, the neighbors forcing these, it seems to be forcing a very certain uh, stereotype on the kids. So, that his kid has to be a footballing
Yeah,
uh, sports athlete.
that's a good call. Yeah, I feel like you wouldn't see that anymore. Um, I thought that what aged well was just like the dynamics of the kids, like talking to like the way that they interact with each other, like the siblings and like the neighbors. I just thought that like those four kids, that could be the way kids were acting today. I thought, other than the special effects, like if you just
Yeah,
watch them interacting, I thought that was pretty normal.
I thought the writing too generally was pretty tight. Like there are a couple of plot holes, but considering it's a movie about shrinking kids, you're not going to get. It makes sense enough, most of it, that you can go with it. But even in kind of some of the incidental dialogue, like as they kind of sweep into the house in one of the opening scenes, that teenage girl's on the phone, assumably talking to a friend about a breakup, and there's a line and she's almost off camera and she says, yeah, they broke up over religious differences. uh, Either he or she, I forget which one, he thought he was God and she didn't, or something like that. It was like a
Yeah,
very tight little joke that was like
yeah.
off to the side. And there was a couple of instances like that where I was like, oh, there was a few humorous pieces of dialogue that weren't really overtly hammered home. They were just kind of left subtle. And I thought for a kids or family movie from 1989, that was it was pretty tight writing, and also just from a point of view of uh, the movie, I think it was like a pretty tight 90 minutes, which you don't see much anymore.
Well, that
And
definitely aged well. Like just they got to make more movies like that, like a tight
yeah,
90 minutes.
yeah, and they didn't over. It wasn't. And maybe they were restricted by what they could do. But I thought what was cool about it and what I liked about it is like it is literally just in the backyard. It's like they have to get from the backyard to inside the house, and once they do that, they're able to resolve the story. Whereas these days, I was thinking when they were in the backyard, I thought there's no way that they would make this movie. Like, so we were talking about them remaking it. What they would do is similar to Toy Story, I think, the original one. They would get connected to a car or something. They would get swept into, and the scale would just be so much bigger. They would be in a mall, and then somehow they would be swept to someone's workplace, or um, a skate park or the beach, or it would have to. I think modern audiences would be fine with this, but I think what the the Hollywood machine, or whatever you want to call it, the industry would do is they'd go, we need to change some of these scene locations. So we need to go to 3 or 4 different places to keep this interesting. Whereas they are kind of just in the backyard for like 40
Yeah,
minutes.
yeah. They just don't make movies like this anymore, you know.
Well, yeah, I think it is an attention span thing, or at least a perceived attention span thing. Although that's interesting because people are saying that attention spans are getting shorter and shorter, and yet movies are also getting longer and longer. So I don't know how that works.
Good point. Um, what was your favorite parenting movie? Best and worst parenting moments?
Well, worst parenting moment I mentioned earlier, leaving the shrink ray unattended. That's a big no-no.
Yeah,
Don't you want to? I mean, in my house, we have a baby gate just in front of the kitchen, let
right.
alone experimental technology.
Yeah,
So that was the worst moment. The positive moment, I think they all, uh, I like Rick's relationship with the kids, particularly maybe my favorite was Rick and his son. He's kind of modeling another kind of oddball sciencey kid, after not modeling after himself, but he's following in his dad's footsteps, and there's kind of a
yeah,
cute kind of father son relationship there.
yeah. I agree. I think for me, actually, the worst thing was just like everything that Dad did to the lawn. Like once you find out that you're shrunk your kids and they're on the lawn, like you should it should be quarantined off. Right, the
Yes.
fact that that kid just was able to walk in there, not mowing the lawn for so like I would be watching the lawn like a hawk. I would be like, he's not checking for birds. Like he's not
Yeah.
really protecting the lawn at all.
You'd think at a minimum you'd just have someone guarding it, just standing
Just
outside.
guarding it.
Hey, walk
Yeah,
around.
yeah. He's not doing anything like that.
Yeah, no, that's a good
Um,
point.
yeah, and I got to give it to Russell. I thought he came around at the end and he let his son know that he's proud of him just the way he is and he doesn't need to do anything special. So I appreciated that from Russell.
You came a long
Uh,
way.
he did, yes. All right. So what are you going to use the shrinking ray for if you had a shrinking ray?
Well, I was at the creek the other day where they have little rapids, and we were putting
Mhm.
a toy. My daughter and I were putting a surfer toy down the rapids, and someone messaged me saying that their friend had always said that they would love to be shrunk down to that size because they were a white water canoer or kayaker, and they said they always dream about going down the rapids. I thought that's actually really cool, but I would change that to surfing. So yeah, I think I'd like to be shrunk, and then I'd hit the beaches so I could have my choice of waves whenever I wanted. Because yeah, it's not hard to find tiny little finger-sized waves.
So you're using this to shrink yourself and then
Yeah,
enjoy the environment around you as opposed to shrinking
yeah.
something else and taking it with you. Okay, interesting. Yeah,
Why? What would you shrink?
I feel like I would like shrink. I don't know, like shrink like shrink a car like I liked his idea of like taking stuff with you places, right? Like I don't know why I was thinking like shrinking a plane to have a plane wherever you go, but I think I'd want to shrink stuff with me to take it with me where I need it.
And then in this situation, you could expand it again. Could
Yeah,
you?
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, I guess we could go.
you could expand yourself, right? If you shrink yourself, you have to expand yourself back, right?
Well, we're about to go away tonight or tomorrow night, just for a night, and we have a tiny little car, and we've been thinking about, it's like, oh, we're getting to a point where we have too much luggage, even just for one night. So I'm like, maybe that would be what I'd do. I'd shrink everything down, and then I'd have it all in the boot of the car. Whereas, like, I could just pick anything from the house that I'd need at any point and just whoosh, expand it. So you'd never forget anything when you went away because everything in your house would be in the boot.